History and Biography is sponsored by Wells Fargo.
Hi there, I'm Judy Woodruff, and I am thrilled to be joining these three amazing authors today. You see them on the screen. They are George Packer, whose latest book, Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century, and Susan Glasser and Peter Baker, whose book just out this fall, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. Two brilliant books about two complicated and fascinating men. They were born a decade apart, Baker in Houston in 1930, Holbrooke in Manhattan in 1941. Baker, a Republican trained as a lawyer, Holbrooke, a Democrat, Foreign Service officer, student of foreign policy. Their lives took very different trajectories, but they both ended up in Washington, where they became major power players. Peter, picking up on that, I mean, this was a man with great ambition, and it was there even before he came to Washington.
Yeah, it was. Look, he is part of a family of Houston aristocracy. His family basically built modern Houston, and he was expected to do great things. He had a very dominating father who imparted on him the legacy of this family. Bakers were meant to do big things. One thing they were not meant to do was politics. He was told, don't do politics. And that's one that the time he finally breaks away from his father's, domination over his life. And his world basically changes at age 40 when he suffers this great family tragedy. His first wife dies of cancer. And it's his friend from the Houston country club tennis courts who helps pick him up, a man named George H.W. Bush. The two of them off on a whole different odyssey that really, I think, put them in the center of world events.
And George, I'm going to be going back and forth because, again, the stories, the books are so rich, and that we could go in so many directions. But I want to try to weave these stories together. George Packer, Richard Holbrooke. I use the word complicated. That doesn't begin to do justice to him. But why did you want to write about him and talk about his ambition, what drove him, and frankly, the fact the first quarter of the book is about Vietnam.
So he died in December 2010. He was actually stricken in Hillary Clinton's office, the Secretary of State's office, which was a fitting finale and a high drama characteristic of him. A few weeks later, his widow offered me his personal papers, and I knew Holbrooke a bit, not very well. And I thought, I have a chance to explore a flamboyant, mesmerizing, maddening character whose career covered the half century from Kennedy to Obama, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, through an intimate look at his diaries and letters and other papers. So I said yes, without really quite knowing why I had said yes. Holbrooke, as soon as I began to read those letters, and some of them were, as you say, Judy, he began his career in South Vietnam, actually in the Mekong Delta, where the war was at its hottest in 1963. And as soon as I began reading his letters from the Mekong Delta to his first wife, I knew I'd made the right choice because he was such a good writer. He was so intelligent, so observant, and funny, and arrogant, and just a guy who could fill a book and maybe more. So his ambition was an engine, a kind of demonic engine that was there from the very start, and that got him into very high places and led to some triumphs, and also, in the end, I think cost him a great deal. Friendships, relationships, and maybe his own heart's desire, which was to rise to the top of his field. He never got there, partly because people found him to be too difficult and abrasive a person, and his ambition, he could never keep it in check.
Demonic engine. What a term. Susan, Peter, talk about Jim Baker and how he came to Washington. He ran the campaign against Ronald Reagan for George H.W. Bush, and yet Ronald Reagan chose him to be his White House chief of staff. And he was seen as probably the most successful person at that job of this modern time. How did he do it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because he didn't really have a background that would necessarily suggest he was going to be successful. He had been a lawyer up until age some, and he ended up running Gerald Ford's campaign in 1976, kind of coming in from nowhere in the wreckage after Watergate. There were no Republicans left of his generation at that point, because the previous group had been convicted, sent off to jail in the Nixon scandal. So it opened up a world for people like Jim Baker, Dick Cheney, Brent Scowcroft, and a whole new generation of people who kind of came to the fore. In his case, I think it's an example of a president that is Ronald Reagan seeing what made sense for him. He was an outsider coming into Washington, but he wanted to get things done, and so he didn't pick Ed Meese, who was his confidant. Ed Meese had the organizational skills to run a White House, didn't understand Washington. Jim Baker, and it's a remarkable thing, as you said. I can't think of another president who would pick the guy who ran not even just one, but two campaigns against him in 76 and 1980 as his chief of staff. But it ended up being, I think, as you said, it ended up being a smart choice on his part.
And Susan, what was that quality in Jim Baker that it got him chosen for that job, that made him as successful as he was? He went on, of course, to be Treasury Secretary, pulled off this big bipartisan tax plan, which, as we know, we haven't seen anything really the likes of it since back during the Reagan years. But what was it about him that pulled it all together?
Well, Judy, Jim Baker, right? This is the question everybody asks him. He will give you this sort of folksy twang, and he'll tell you, well, my family has an adage: prior preparation prevents poor performance. But we all know pretty well that Washington is a city full of ambitious lawyers who do their homework and stay up late. And, certainly it's true that Jim Baker was assiduous to the point of obsessive when it came to getting the job done. And he was famous for staying in the White House at night in the Reagan White House until he returned every phone call from every member of Congress, often after he knew they had already gone home, by the way. This is the pre-email, pre-internet era. But, that's not the secret. Obviously, there are plenty of people who know their brief and are extremely well prepared. Certainly, that's one aspect of it. But I think Peter and I found in working on the book that, in the end, for Jim Baker, success was really the only option. He's obsessed with winning. And I think the hyper competitiveness is part of what he had in common with George H.W. Bush. I think that's how they bonded on the tennis courts. And by the way, there are varying stories about how they came to be teamed up as a doubles team. But I think one simple answer is in a picture I was just looking at the other day of Jim Baker pointing to the wall before George H.W. Bush showed up in Houston. Guess who'd been the singles champion at the Houston Country Club for the past few years? It was James A. Baker III. And George H.W. Bush wanted to be teamed up with a winner. There's no question about that. Jim Baker's father exerted this, and his family in general, exerted this overweening power over his early years, right? And it shaped him as a person. His dad literally beat this kind of competitiveness into him. They joked and called him the warden, but Jim Baker would go and play tennis matches. His father was also an obsessive tennis player. And when he was done as a young boy playing his match, his father would make him stay on the court and keep practicing. And I think that tells you an awful lot. Baker and Holbrooke, both men of overweening ambition, both had a certain insecurity and obsession with how they were perceived by others. But the difference was that Jim Baker, I think, had this enormous self-discipline, whereas Holbrooke, in a way, is this sprawling character who emerges in George's wonderful and powerful book. And, Baker just took that discipline that was beaten into him. And ironically, politics was his rebellion. He never could have done it while his dad was still around and alive. And it was only after his dad passed from the scene that he rebelled from the family tradition and came north to Washington.
George, pick up on that. I mean, there's so much to say, as we keep saying, about Richard Holbrooke. I mean, his area was foreign policy. It was understanding the world. People talk about what a brilliant, was he another version of a Henry Kissinger? How did you see him in his take on the world as a diplomat? And how did he combine that with getting things done in Washington?
So a few things. First of all, there's some overlapping themes here between Peter and Susan's book and mine. One is ambition and one is tennis. Holbrooke played a ton of tennis, and I had this feeling that he rose up through the hierarchy in Saigon and then in Washington by whipping people on the tennis court, or by being at least so competitive that they had to respect him. First, there was Anthony Lake, who was his close friend and peer in the Foreign Service in Saigon. And they remained friends for about 10 years. And then their friendship mysteriously disintegrated, with great consequences for them and for U.S. foreign policy, I think, later when they were working together on Bosnia under Bill Clinton. Then he started playing tennis against Westmoreland and Maxwell Taylor in Saigon, and eventually got to Bobby Kennedy in Washington. And this is how Holbrooke maneuvered in order to be invited to the best dinner tables in Georgetown, the best of them all being Averell Harriman's. He revered this post-war generation of American statesmen, from Averell Harriman to George Kennan, Clark Clifford, George Marshall. He thought of them as the model for him. He wanted to be just like them. The problem was he was a very different man. He was not born to the WASP aristocracy. He was Jewish, although he never talked about it, and kind of had an outsider's rawness and even uncouthness that kept getting in his way, as well as being a way for him to push other people aside and get ahead. And the times changed. The foreign policy establishment was falling apart during Holbrooke's career in the wake of Vietnam. There was no longer that group of wise men who simply could be called upon by presidents to give advice. So Holbrooke was forever trying to get to the top of a mountain. He loved mountain climbing stories, and always just falling short of the summit. I have this line about he got to the highest base camp imaginable, but every assault on the summit failed. And I think it's partly because history changed. He was not Henry Kissinger, to answer that question, Judy. He didn't have a geostrategic mind. He was more of an operative. He was a guy who went in and got things done, especially in foreign countries, in Bosnia, for example. And times change, and Holbrooke was not cut out to smoothly ride his way to the top. He wasn't self-disciplined like Baker, as Susan said. He was undisciplined. He was transparent. His appetites and insecurities were all on the surface. He thought he was playing people when in fact they saw right through him. And in the end, the relationship that failed him was the one with Barack Obama, who he desperately wanted to work closely with and to be trusted by him. Obama never trusted, never liked him. And in the end, Holbrooke died to some degree of a broken heart, with a sense of failure at the end of his life.
Sorry, I was going to just add this quickly on the parallels between these two men who are vastly different in a lot of ways, and yet ambition being one of the similarities. But also, I think what made them successful, I think they both were relentless and they both were instinctive.
I've been looking for, I mean, again, so many things to explore. I've been looking for places where maybe where their lives intersected. They obviously knew of each other, maybe knew each other better. You can comment on that. But I was looking at the period of the Balkans. I mean, Baker obviously was there in the administration at the end of the Cold War. The Balkans, interesting. I remember he said something about, we don't have a dog in that fight. And then later that became the place of Richard Holbrooke's greatest triumph. It's a place, but it may be a way, George, to look at, I mean, what was it about the Balkans that lent itself to Richard Holbrooke's strengths, weaknesses?
I think that line, "We don't have a dog in that fight," was crucial because it said something about James Baker's worldview and his view of American foreign policy and where we had interest and where we didn't. He looked at the Balkans and just saw a hopeless, ancient Slavic struggle that we could never understand and had no business getting involved in. He made a very cursory effort to try to negotiate with Milosevic and other Balkan leaders at the beginning of the war. He botched it. The war happened anyway. Bill Clinton inherited it at a terrible stage in Bosnia. It's not Baker's finest hour, and it shows something about the limits of his cold-eyed realism, because I think the difference is Holbrooke had a passionate sense that America had to be involved in the Bosnias of the world, that if we let that country bleed, it would eventually become our problem. It would possibly rupture the transatlantic alliance. It was not of no consequence. We actually did have a dog in that fight. And once Holbrooke committed himself to that, and he did it in a way that showed he really did care about other countries and people in places whose names we can't pronounce, who are suffering in civil war and as refugees and in floods and famines. This was something that characterized him throughout his career. He had a passionate humanitarian streak, and that was activated by the suffering in the Balkans, as was his very sort of post-war Harriman, Atchison, Kennan sense that America had to lead. And so he was not going to stop until he had a deal at Dayton. And that relentlessness that Peter mentioned is exactly what Bosnia brought out in him. The same qualities did not work in other places, but in Bosnia, all of Holbrooke's strengths came together and he achieved what is his claim to history, which is the Dayton Peace Accords.
And Susan, listening to you, I mean, I'm thinking about how Baker looked back on the Balkans at the end of your book, and another period, of course, the first Iraq War, 1990, the first Gulf War, where in writing the book, he wanted to take out references to, there was a line in there about, maybe we should have stayed longer. We could have done something about Saddam Hussein. He didn't want that in there, clearly suggesting he felt maybe mistakes were made.
Well, look, I think Jim Baker was a pragmatist and a realist, and he came by that through his own experience. He was not a tilter at windmills. He was not all about imposing a freedom agenda or a democracy agenda on the world. Baker was essentially very calculating about where he saw a deal was possible. Then he was going to jump on it. Where he didn't see one, he was going to be pretty disciplined. For example, at the beginning of the Bush presidency, when he became Secretary of State, he wasn't interested at all in the Middle East. His aides couldn't get him to pay attention to it because there was no deal there. And he understood he had to focus on his priorities. It's part of why some of the career diplomats were suspicious of him, right? He was going to have his own very political list of what he thought he could accomplish, and he wasn't going to focus on the rest. So he was looking for the deal. And I think that is the key to understanding his foreign policy worldview, more than even a kind of either mushy centrism or an idea that he was a rigid kind of isolationist. He wasn't. He was very much willing to assert American power in the world, but nobody was quite sure what the contours of that new power would be as the Soviet Union, the world was falling apart in 1989 to 1991.
And George, talk a little bit about Holbrooke's view of all that and how he maneuvered. And you talked about the Balkans, but how did he maneuver in the aftermath, in this post-Cold War era?
I think Holbrooke would not have been masterful as Baker was at the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Holbrooke, in a weird way, never showed much interest in the greatest foreign policy issue of his life, which was the Cold War. I think he found the Soviet Union maybe just too abstract, too static. Not enough was happening. Nuclear arms talks was something that Holbrooke would never have gotten interested in. His intensity and attention were always directed toward particular countries where there was conflict and where there was suffering. Vietnam, Bosnia, Afghanistan. Once the Cold War ended, I think Holbrooke saw the opportunity for Democrats to re-enter the foreign policy arena. He had been scarred by Vietnam, as was every Democrat of his generation, both by having been involved in the war and by being tarred as doves for thinking that we needed to get out, which was the position he ended up in. So he was always looking over his right shoulder, worried about an attack from the Hawks. Once the Cold War ended, in a sense, that pressure was off. And I think he had an outsized idea of what America could do as the sole superpower. He wanted to be involved not just in Bosnia, but in Kosovo, in Cyprus, in East Timor, in Congo, not with military power, but certainly as a kind of all-purpose negotiator, the Horn of Africa. There were all these small wars going on in the 90s as countries were disintegrating, and Holbrooke seemed to find them all sort of irresistible. So in a way, Baker is more, I think, of a Kissinger figure who had a sort of large view of what was possible, what was not, and of foreign policy as geopolitics, whereas Holbrooke was more of an operative who would go in and try to solve a particular problem. I think in the post-Cold War era, he was both at his best and also maybe at his most excessive, and got himself into some troubles that he had a hard time getting out of.
And Peter, I'd like you to pick up on that. I mean, I looked. There was one line I wrote down about Baker. In the end, when you were writing about how much he wanted to be seen as a diplomat, again, working on the book, but I'm quoting, he was, after all, a fixer. No matter how much he tried to break out of that straitjacket, but a fixer who shaped world events. George is saying James Baker, was in some respects more like Henry Kissinger, but there was a difference.
Well, there's a difference. That's right. I think Baker is like Kissinger in the sense that they took on the big things, right? Baker was unsentimental. He wasn't moved by pictures of suffering. He would never have thought East Timor was worth his time. He was very, very calculating in that sense. But he was not like Kissinger in the sense he didn't have a great world strategy, a world geopolitical view of things. He would not have gotten into a discussion with you about the Treaty of Westphalia. He was, in the end, a fixer, a lawyer who knew how to negotiate, a political, operative who knew how to get legislation through, a campaign leader who could, negotiate debates with the other team. And the great downfall of his life, the thing that crushed him the most, was when he had been Secretary of State for 3.5 years. He had negotiated the Madrid peace talks and brought the coalition together for the Gulf War and managed the unification of Germany. And then his friend George Bush calls him back to the White House. He's about to lose re-election. He needs Baker to come back and once again resume that role of a fixer. And this was just a crushing blow for Baker. He couldn't stand the idea that suddenly he was worrying about bunting and balloons again instead of the great issues of the day. And in fact, through the fall, as he was once again at the White House managing a losing campaign, his own staff, felt like he wasn't really in it. They confronted him and said, "Why aren't you doing anything?" They called his wife and said, "You've got to get on his case." Even Barbara Bush was convinced that Baker wasn't really all in for her husband. In fact, thought that he was trying to avoid blame for the coming loss being heaped on his shoulders, and it caused this rift between Baker and the Bush family that took years to kind of really resolve. And so, yeah, you're right. The fixer was the thing he wanted to transcend, and in the end, it's the thing that he couldn't escape.
Now, I was covering Washington then, and I remember felt like we waited around for months for Baker to get into the campaign. The problems they were having. George, we've talked about the ambition of these two men. In Holbrooke's case, larger than life pluses, larger than life flaws. What was it about him that in the end you think kept him from realizing? I mean, he really wanted to be Secretary of State. You mentioned, what happened between him and President Obama. What was it about him?
Well, in 1996, he had just achieved his greatest triumph, which was the Dayton peace talks. And Bill Clinton was reelected and had to decide who would replace Warren Christopher as his Secretary of State. And it came down to Richard Holbrooke and Madeleine Albright. And Clinton was actually leaning toward Holbrooke because he said he's brilliant, he has a great mind, he knows more, he's relentless. Hillary Clinton wanted her husband to pick the first female Secretary of State, which weighed decisively. But in the end, Clinton said to Al Gore, I don't think Holbrooke has the self-awareness to keep relationships from becoming toxic. That was Clinton's very shrewd analysis of Holbrooke's character. Holbrooke understood the person across the table brilliantly, whether it was Slobodan Milosevic or Bill Clinton. He did not know himself very well. He couldn't see himself. He couldn't laugh at himself. He couldn't see himself as others were seeing him. There was a kind of lifelong blindness to his own flaws and his own character that I think was a fatal flaw. In the end, it meant he could negotiate. But when there was an obstacle that lay within himself, he didn't know how to get around it. And that was what undid his relationship with Barack Obama. Holbrooke was driving Obama crazy with his lecturing and flattering and talking about Vietnam and like this ancient mariner coming to grab the young president by the lapels and say, you must listen to me. I've been there. I know. And Obama couldn't stand it. So, and Holbrooke did not know why none of his charms and his talents were working with this sterling young president who he desperately wanted to impress. And that was the reason why I think he never got that job of his heart's desire, Secretary of State. The reason was himself. I actually wanted to ask Susan and Peter one question, if I can. How do you think, so Holbrooke's boss, Warren Christopher, became the counterpart to James Baker in Bush v. Gore and was beaten. And I've always felt that showed James Baker was a kind of blue-eyed killer. No one could beat him when it came down to that kind of contest. How do you think Richard Holbrooke would have done going up against James Baker on the floor to recount? Obviously, he's not a political operative. He's not a campaign manager. He's not a lawyer, but he is a brilliant negotiator. How do you think Holbrooke would have done against Baker?
You know, George, that's an awesome question. I have to say, one of the interesting things going back to that 2000 recount, it was many Democrats who said to me that we knew that Al Gore was toast as soon as we heard that Jim Baker had been involved. So I think that, you know, people were well aware, even at the time, even before the recount, of the differences between those two men. But here's the thing. One of Christopher's great mistakes actually was sitting down, and we tell the story in the book of the two of them sitting down for this first meeting, this dramatic moment. The election is undecided. What's going to happen in Florida? Christopher's blocked off a whole amount of time to sit there and thinks they're going to roll up their, pinstripe suit, shirt sleeves and get down to business of negotiating. Jim Baker wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to win. And I don't think, that fundamentally, I think, is where his experience as a corporate lawyer for decades came into it. So I think there would have been an asymmetry there between Holbrooke and Baker that did come from his understanding of what a high stakes legal venture this was. He understood he wanted to get out of the Florida courts, and he had a very, calculated and disciplined sense of what it took. And he wasn't going to jawbone. He had no interest, in fact, in sitting there and figuring out what was in the mind of Al Gore or Warren Christopher. So that might have made it hard for Holbrooke to negotiate in this particular situation. And you also have to come back to, do you have the wasta and the respect to command your own team? And I think that was one of Baker's hidden assets always in dealing with Bush. Certainly those two, Peter and I have been having a debate about this. Were they the closest Secretary of State and President ever? Or were they the closest and friendliest Secretary of State and President since Madison and Jefferson? He thinks ever. I'm not so sure because I'm not an expert on Madison and Jefferson. But
this is what goes on at your dinner table, huh?
I know that Jim Baker would have appreciated Richard Holbrooke as a worthy adversary and a debate partner. That's for sure. He recognizes excellence, and by the way, at a very sexist time, women, men, he likes to play tennis against a good player, and
Yeah.
he would have known Holbrooke for a good player.
Yeah, but it's a great thought experiment to think about what would it have been, Baker versus Holbrooke. Peter, pick up on George's. I mean, let me ask you. He talked about, in the end, Richard Holbrooke really didn't know himself. Does Jim Baker know himself?
That's a great question. He is not a reflective person. He's not an introspective guy. In going through his paper, I love doing this book. We love doing this book because he was open with us. We have a live subject, and George didn't, right? So we got the chance to ask him all these questions. And the truth is, he's not somebody who's going to open up his psychological profile to you and really, expose himself in that way. He is super disciplined even to this day. But he did give us access to his papers, and his papers aren't, again, like Holbrooke's letters, I think, from Vietnam. They weren't expressive in that way, but there were little clues here or there. And one of them that I thought that was just very human was this, tragedy we mentioned earlier where his first wife dies of cancer. And he gave us a letter that has never been published before.
Saw that.
That he writes.
It was stunning.
Yes, he writes to his friend George Bush. His friend George Bush is going to move from the House to a run for Senate, and he's trying to get Baker to run for his House seat. Baker writes him a letter explaining why he's not going to make the campaign. He says to his friend George that the reason why is because his wife is dying, and even she doesn't know it. The doctors haven't told him. This is back, of course, in the era where maybe that was considered to be okay, where the husband was told and the wife wasn't. And he said to his friend,
even at the time, it wasn't okay.
Even at the time. But he says to his friend, I can't do it because my wife is dying. I haven't told anybody. I haven't told her. I haven't told my kids. I haven't told my mother. The one person he tells is George Bush. That is a friendship that is, in fact, powerful and transformative. And that's human, right? So that to have him give us that letter, I think, showed us inside a little bit in a way we had. He also, by the way, gave us another letter. His wife, his dying wife, Mary Stuart, writes him a letter because, in fact, she does know she's dying. And she hides it in the house to be given to him after he dies. And when he hands us this letter 50 years later, he's crying even to this day. And so it's a very human story. It's a very powerful story. It's not introspective. It's not psychologically open the way Holbrooke kind of was. I think George's character study of Holbrooke is so powerful, so rich, so three-dimensional. Baker is not that kind of a person, but he is a human person. And I thought that was one of the things that really made this book a lot of fun.
And that letter,
Peter, my book, to be able to do my book depended on Holbrooke not being alive. You had all the advantages of being able to talk to James Baker, the advantages of not having Richard Holbrooke looking over my shoulder. And in fact, he wouldn't have given me his papers at all. And all the people who talked to me didn't have to worry about what he would say once he found out what they had said to me. So for me, this had to be the story of a man who had come and gone. And that was how I was able to write as honestly as I
well,
Mm-hmm.
and that's an important distinction. I mean, both Holbrooke and Baker, to bring it back to this question, were extremely astute in different ways at managing their images. Both their critics would say that was one of their great skills, was actually talking to reporters and people like us, and that they had an extreme sensitivity toward their own image. Judy, you pointed out one of the great sources for us in writing this book actually was looking at what Baker insisted be deleted from his memoirs of his State Department years and his time in public life, because it's often the stage managing of your image and the parts that they don't want to tell you that are as revealing as anything else. But I would say that, Jim Baker, he's not a diarist. He's not, keeping his personal historian around to document things. And we did have the benefit of talking to a subject late in life. He's just turned 90 this year. He's written 2 memoirs of his own. And I found him to be surprisingly candid with us, especially about his family. You get a certain level of self-awareness by the time you're 90. And, if you could talk about how you called your dad the warden, and how your father micromanaged you so much that even after you were a Marine veteran and graduated from college, you agreed not only to go to the law school that he insisted that you go to, but to sign up for the fraternity with undergraduates because that was a fraternity his father thought a member of their family should be in. He was willing to get surprisingly personal in a way that I think helped us understand that it's not just a resume that you're talking to, and that you have to look at those personal qualities to understand what made him able to tackle a series of Washington's hardest jobs in a way that actually nobody else has done in such a compressed period of time in the modern era.
I want to finally ask you all about, today's Washington and how, I'm interested, George, to know how you think Holbrooke would be able to function in a Washington of today, party out of power, but what would it be like? The city has changed. And Peter, Jim Baker, what does he think of what's going on now? And we know this interview will be released in September, so time will pass from another month or so. But George, what about that?
I think he would have been at sea. He was shaped, as I've said, by the post-war. His DNA were the architects of the post-war world. They were the influences that he never stopped comparing himself to. And today, first of all, Trump's Washington would be just a mind-bogglingly alien and appalling place for Richard Holbrooke. Everything that Trump does in foreign policy is the opposite of what Richard Holbrooke would do. Everything. I can't think of a single move Trump has made that Holbrooke would have agreed with, and vice versa. So he would have been writing columns for the Washington Post. He would have been denouncing the isolationism, America first. He would have been talking about the importance of the transatlantic alliance and NATO and our allies in Asia. During the pandemic, I think he would have been a brilliant organizer of other countries to find a cooperative response. That was the kind of thing he excelled at. He put HIV/AIDS as an issue before the UN Security Council. So he understood that a disease could be a threat to our national security. But I think in a way he would have been superannuated and out to sea. He would not have known how to function. Social media would have brought out all his worst qualities, I think, and none of his best. He wouldn't, the schmoozing and seducing of reporters, mental seducing, I should say, of reporters that he excelled at isn't something that is so easily done and matters so much anymore. So I think it would have been an alien world for him, and he would have felt as if the golden age was gone.
And Peter, James Baker is a Republican. He's watching closely what's going on.
Yeah, I think he finds the Trump world maddening. I think it is the antithesis of everything that he believed about governance and politics. Trump is the anti-Baker. Trump is tearing down basically both the architecture of world, affairs and the Republican Party that Baker spent a lifetime building up. I found in doing the research one night, I was actually covering the impeachment trial of President Trump, and I was going through some Baker files one night after deadline, and I found this memo that I hadn't noticed before, and it was a memo that Baker had written to the file because Baker kept integrity, at least the appearance of ethical behavior, meant so much to him that he kept a file of all the instances where people asked him to do things he thought were crossing a line, so that he would keep a record showing that he would not do that. And one of the memos he had in there was a memo about 4 Republican congressmen coming to George Bush at the end of the 1992 campaign saying, hey, you're losing. You need to ask Britain and you need to ask Russia for help understanding about Bill Clinton's overseas activities when he was young. And Baker and Bush said, no, that crosses the line. We do not ask foreign powers for help in our domestic elections. And there that memo was when I was looking at that. I was just so struck by it, right? Because it's such a contrast with what we were covering during the day.
Look, I think Peter's point, Judy, is really well taken. Jim Baker was the un-Trump in many ways, and yet he could not disavow him. I sat down with him a few days before the 2016 election, and he was a man stricken. He was absolutely in pain and tortured over what to do about Donald Trump. He told me Donald Trump doesn't believe anything that I believe when it comes to foreign policy. He's saying crazy things. In fact, he told me that he thought Donald Trump was nuts, and yet he couldn't bring himself to reject the party's nominee. Jim Baker came out of his time in Washington convinced that the only way to wield power is from the inside. And he's just not a man who thinks there's any efficacy whatsoever in being in the outside howling and complaining, that no one will take you seriously. And, this is the struggle of the Republican Party under Trump. And it's really been, I think, a window into the party's soul to watch Jim Baker wrestle with Donald Trump, who on a personal level is the exact opposite of him. And yet Baker's never brought himself to publicly denounce Trump and to disavow the turn in the Republican Party that he spent his whole life working in a different direction.
Fascinating. Just it's all fascinating, endlessly fascinating. These two men who clearly helped shape Washington with such enduring legacies. The books could not be more important right now. And I want to again thank these amazing authors: George Packer, author of Our Man; Richard Holbrooke, At the End of the American Century; and Susan Glasser and Peter Baker, the man who ran Washington, the life and times of James A. Baker III. Thank you all three for just an extraordinary conversation.
Thanks to you, Judy.
Thanks so much, Judy.